we're curious to know, Beth, what grabbed you about the Evelyn Waugh novel that is your favorite?
I want to say a thing first about my reaction to returning to this book after whatever it is, 40 years, which is this: I'm interested in what you all, I am now, as of this today, particularly interested in what we all think about humor and anger. Jane Austen, of course, is funny, although we wouldn't call her a comic writer, but her first novel was Northanger Abbey. It was published last, but it was written first, and it's a literary parody of the Anne Radcliffe and the Gothic novel school, which was the popular genre fiction of the day. And similar to that, Cold Comfort Farm, which I think is a scream, of Stella Gibbons, is also a literary parody of this time of Wuthering Heights and D.H. Lawrence and the sort of school of rural drama. But my point is the parody is always aimed at somebody. And anytime you take aim at another human being, there's a snark factor. And that brings me to Evelyn Waugh. I loved Handful of Dust, and a lot of other people said Handful of Dust, but I have a real weakness for first novels, and so I chose his first novel, Decline and Fall, which is, I don't know if it's that first novelists can be more reckless because they don't really know if they're going to be published, or maybe it's just that sort of the same thing as a singer-songwriter's first album, just being often the best, just all that stuff that's been saved up until such time as you have a voice. So I chose Decline and Fall, which is set in a 10th grade boarding school in Wales, and it's run by an old fraud called, he calls himself Dr. Augustus Fagan. Waugh had, right after Oxford, found himself teaching at a similar school, and he hated it so much that he actually went out one night down to the beach, took off all his clothes, folded them neatly, and tried to swim out to sea and drown himself. But he ran into a school of jellyfish, so he swam back. I've decided to read a snippet from the scene I posted about, because I remember it as being so outrageously funny. The scene is Sports Day, which has been called very impromptu because the richest parents in the school, Lord and Lady Circumference, are coming to visit their son, Little Lord Tangent. And Dr. Fagan has called for the Sports Day, but it's not going well because they can't have the hurdle race because the hurdles have all been burned for firewood. And they don't have a starter pistol, but it turns out that Filbert, the phony butler, has a real pistol, and it's loaded. And the history teacher is also loaded, and he's soon going to shoot Little Lord Tangent in the foot. But before that, this happens. 10 men of revolting appearance were approaching from the drive. They were low of brow, crafty of eye, and crooked of limb. They advanced huddled together with the loping tread of wolves, peering about them furtively as they came, as though in constant terror of ambush. They slavered at their mouths, which hung loosely over their receding chins, while each clutched under his ape-like arm a burden of curious and unaccountable shape. On seeing the doctor, they halted and edged back, those behind squinting and mouthing over their companions' shoulders. "Crikey," said Filbert. "Loonies, this is where I shoot." The leader steps forward and says, "We are the Silver Band, the Lord bless and keep you. The band that no one could beat whatever but two indeed in the iced fog that for all North Wales was, look you." "I see," said the doctor. "I see, that's splendid. Well, will you please go into your tent, the little tent over there? To march about you would not like us? We have a fine yellow flag, look you, that embroidered for us was in silks." Which makes you think, maybe that's where Yoda got his dictionary. Anyway, I had often quoted from this book and returned to favorite scenes, but I hadn't read it all the way through in quite a long time, and I did this weekend. And I found myself sort of struck by how different my reaction was than when I first read it when I was myself young and angry and heartless. I'm not so sure how funny I would find this if I were Welsh. And most of us mellow as we have more invested in the world as it really is instead of the absurdist vision some of us see when we're young. But there's a connection between very funny books and anger, and it's complicated. Waugh and Kingsley Amis, who wrote, of course, Lucky Jim, which was his first novel, and Catch-22 was also a first novel, three, arguably, of the funniest books written in English in the 20th century. So that's another reason that I wanted to stay with the first novel. Waugh and Kingsley Amis both stayed very misogynist and nasty right to the end, but they did get less funny. And Nancy Mitford, for example, once wrote to Evelyn Waugh. She loved him dearly, but she was appalled at his attitudes toward almost everybody. And she wrote and said, "I don't understand how you can call yourself a Catholic when you're so horrible about everybody." And Waugh said, "You have no idea how much more horrible I would be if I weren't a Catholic." By contrast, there are very funny novelists who aren't angry, and they seem to be able to write books throughout their careers that maintain the same lightness and charm. Nancy Mitford, sort of. P.J. Wodehouse, for sure. Eleanor Lippman in our generation, and Christopher Buckley can all do that. And I just want to circle around for one more minute to where I started, which is Dickens, because Decline and Fall is very obviously descended from Nicholas Nickleby, who finds himself teaching in a 10th grade boarding school called Dotheboys Hall in Yorkshire, run by an old sadist called Wackford Squeers. And I just wanted to mention the sheer and innocent pleasure of funny names, which Dickens and Waugh were great at, because Christopher Buckley really is too. And if you haven't read Supreme Courtship, I recommend it, if only for the slimy DC lawyer called Blister Fork Morgan.
I'll have to look for the Christopher Buckley. Yeah. You're making me think of a couple of the Handful of Dust fans. Morris Dixon said that the best comic novels revel in caricature, and a Handful of Dust is a work of the most exquisite social cruelty. The people in it are grasping and hypocritical, yet so over the top that the result is funny. Not funny exactly, but sad funny. They are lethally unconcerned about other people as they chew them up, including those closest to them. The book concludes amazingly with the chief character held prisoner in the tropics, forced endlessly to read Dickens to his captor. Certainly a novel form of sadism in every sense of the word. So Dickens is indeed one of our favorites. He comes up along with Tristram Shandy and Tom Jones and Pride and Prejudice and David Copperfield. But I also want to mention that Maureen Corrigan talked about Lucky Jim, Kingsley Amis's first novel. She said, Amis's funniest novel ever. Nothing could possibly be Kingsley Amis's description of how his hero feels upon waking up with a hangover. Quote, he felt as though some small creature of the night had used his mouth first as a latrine and then as a mausoleum. Genius, she concludes. I'm going to ask Rob Spilman to talk a little bit about another kind of cult classic. Catch-22 became a book that people reached toward and a touchstone in the culture for many years. In the late 70s and 80s, there was a series of novels that became similarly important to people. So Rob, can you talk to us a little bit about Douglas Adams and his work?
My pick for the blog was Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe, Douglas Adams. It was a serialized novel in sort of six, 7 parts, depending on how you count it, that came out in England and was actually made into a fairly decent movie. But for me, it is sort of emblematic of my favorite kind of comic novel, which is the one that's a doomed quest. From Don Quixote to Confederacy of Dunces, they're my favorite kind of thing. And I think the reason I like them so much is that they are filled with pathos, and they come from what you referenced as a deep down place. And then sort of to paraphrase Oscar Wilde, that if you're going to tell people the truth, you better be funny. And for me, I would much rather listen to the truth coming from George Carlin or Andy Kaufman or Richard Pryor, people who are darkly funny, than just sort of people who are sort of topically, we're doing shtick, versus people who are actually getting at social truths. And for me, Douglas Adams, I mean, it's a completely absurd plot. It's in the first couple of pages of the book, a drinking buddy of the hero reveals that he's actually an alien, and that the Earth is going to be blown up in a minute, and they have to get off the planet. And it's like, well, you must be a blind drunk, but it's true. The Earth is being demolished for an interstellar highway. And the eviction notice has been posted for thousands of years, and humans are too stupid to know about this. And so he's plucked off the planet by his friend and jumps on a cargo ship, and is doomed to spend the rest of his life floating through space as the last human. And it's hysterically funny. You know, you wouldn't think it would be hysterically funny, but it is. And to me, I love those kind of doomed narrators, and I think that it comes out of a place of the class smart aleck finally figuring out how to get paid for being the smart aleck. You know, all through their lives, these kinds of writers were probably slapped by their teachers for being, you know, speaking out of turn. And my contemporary favorites right now are Sam Lipsyte, wrote The Ask and Homeland, and they're just really bleakly funny books. Amy Bender, the particular Sadness of Lemon Cake novel. Karen Russell wrote Swamplandia, which came out last year, or actually this year even. Which is about a doomed alligator farm, a teenage girl inheriting a doomed alligator farm in Florida. And of course, Jennifer Egan's Visit to a Goon Squad. I think all of these sort of exemplify what I look for. And I run a literary magazine that I've been running for 13 years, and all of my editors I've worked for a very long time. And the one thing that we fight over the most is humor. I will bring in a story that I think is completely hilarious, and I won't have prepared any argument about it, because I think it's self-evident, and my editors will all turn on me and say this is not even remotely funny, and then vice versa. I mean, we have the worst fights over, you call that funny? And so I think it really, a lot of it comes down to particular taste. I mean, some people don't find my brand of humor funny at all. They just think, I think Kafka is hilarious, but a lot of people don't.
I'm glad you brought up Amy Bender and Karen Russell. How many of you read these recent books? Have anybody looked at The Particular Sadness of Lemon Cake and Swamplandia, which was in the New Yorker? Swamplandia has a character whose mother is a person who dives into the alligator tank. I mean, it begins with this, kind of amazing kind of sideshow kind of thing in the swamps. It goes on from there. She keeps the tone going very well all the way through. And Amy Bender's book is sort of Salinger-esque in a way. It reminded me a lot of early Salinger. Contemporary books were often mentioned in this thing. We had Richard Russo's Straight Man come up a lot of times. And I'm noticing the interest in comedy that comes out of the academic world through the prep schools or through colleges. Alexander Maxick, who wrote a wonderful first novel this year called You Deserve Nothing, wrote about Straight Man. He says, I love novels about people who've come unglued. And Straight Man is one of the funniest I've ever read. Anyone who seeks to resolve English department budget problems by threatening to kill campus ducks is someone I want to know. You know, he really has it. And Hiller McAlpin, one of our other contributors, called Arthur Phillips's latest, The Tragedy of Arthur, a total hoot, an audacious riff on memoirs, authenticity, and Shakespeare. We had another comment from Karen Long of the Book Critics Board. She's the Cleveland plain dealer and book editor. She wrote about Joshua Ferris's Then We Came to the End. Quote, the dude writing a screenplay who insists on referring to Bobby De Niro, the colleague too cheap to tip the waitress, forcing everyone else to cover his share at lunch, the illicit couple copulating after hours on desks we hope to God were not ours. We in the office world know these people. We work with them, she wrote. Anyway, we also had a comment from Damien Searles, who is the translator of the late Hans Kielson's Comedy in a Minor Key and a collaborator at the Center for Fiction. Well, the new book out is a translation of Proust, some Proust essays. Anyway, he was a finalist for this year's Fiction Award, and he wrote that the funniest book he'd read for the past 10 less than hilarious years was both deeply moving and literally laugh out loud in public funny is Ed Park's Personal Days, an in-office dystopia fizzing with the formal and verbal energy, which brings us to Parul Sehgal, who's another fan of Personal Days, and I think she's going to give us a sense of why she thinks that's the funniest book she's read.
I would love to, but Personal Days is not my book.
Oh, it's not?
No, but no, it's okay because I can make a very elegant segue.
Okay, all right.
And my book actually is kind of in conversation with your book, and it's kind of in conversation with what you were saying about the campus novel. This is my much-handled favorite book. Okay, I'm excited to read Personal Days. It's my very fragile copy of The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, much-handled. It's kind of like cigarette paper at this point. Like it's just, and I love it. There's a great book, James Wood has a great book about comedy. I think it's called In the Irresponsible Self, or is it Irresponsible Self, I think. And he talks about two kinds of comedy. There's comedy of correction and comedy of forgiveness. Comedy of correction he describes as a sort of, it's Evelyn Waugh, it's Muriel Spark, it's we're going to make a point by punishing our characters. And there's a healthy amount of sadism in it. Comedy of forgiveness, for me, has always been like a very American kind of humor, very sort of Brady Udall, like, let's look at our flaws, let's see how this knits us into this whole, there's none of this in Muriel Spark. Muriel Spark is just, it's an incredible book. It's slim, she wrote it in a month, she wrote it longhand, she wrote it in a journal, and when you can find her drafts, and it's like she was taking dictation. Almost nothing was crossed out. It's just as if it just flowed from her pen. It's the story, I think, it's very simple. It's the story of a very charismatic, very strange, possibly sociopathic teacher named Miss Jean Brodie, who collects the smartest girls every year, or is it every year, or every couple of years, and they become the Brodie set. And there's 6 very, very different girls. One of them is excellent at tumbling. One of them will be famous for sex one day. One of them is famous for having a good brain for figures. And the story is Miss Brodie, who's constantly at odds with the school, is finally betrayed. And the book is about which one of her set betrayed her. Really, really simple story, made, for me, hilarious, just because Muriel Spark loves torturing her characters. If Nabokov's characters were galley slaves, Muriel Spark's characters are paper dolls or Barbies, the Barbies you torture and chew up. She's furious at them for no earthly reason. Aristotle said that comedy's one ingredient was a lack of compassion. And Muriel Spark will have a character that she describes as a lump and stupid and unattractive. And just when you feel like there's some moment of redemption, Muriel Spark has her die awfully in a fire. So it's just one after another. She's relentless. So James Wood also said, there are only a few instances of laughter in the Old Testament, and it's always before Yahweh smites someone. So it's like, there are three moments of Yahweh laughing in the Psalms right before he's like, and then the sinner's time is nigh. You know, so Muriel Spark has that moment where you can see her getting really, really funny. funny right before she does something really, really awful. So this is my book. I love it. I'm really excited to read Personal Days. Yeah, you should all read this.
What a graceful segue, you think? I got my pages mixed up. Good for you. Oh, and her reviews are equally graceful, by the way. I'm going to pop down a couple of more just to make sure I cover all what we call the long tail among our many contributors. Oscar Villalone talked about Arthur Bandini, the young struggling writer, in John Fonte's Ask the Dust. He describes it as both hilarious and desperate. Bandini grows on you as you see through his posturing. He's his own worst enemy, but aren't we all? Eric Banks, who's the current NBCC president, suggests a comic classic called Diary of a Nobody, about George and by George and Whedon Grossmith. He said it's a book I find myself rereading at least once a year. As a novel, it's a bit threadbare, but for satiric genius, the low jinks adventures of Charlie Pooter, his theatrical son Lupin, and his horrible friends Cummings and Gowing stand up a century after their creation.